So today we're going to talk about the church. And I'll start with this. In every culture, people are conditioned to look at the world in a certain kind of way, right? So the centerpiece of Western culture, and by that I mean the European Americas, as opposed to the Eastern, which would be the Asian. The centerpiece of the Western culture, at least how it's evolved in the last couple of hundred years, is that we tend to see ourselves as consumers, right? That is, we look at the world through the lens weighing benefits versus the cost. And so to do that, we do that just with about everything. Everything you look at, cost versus benefits, that's a part. But also can be described as a what's in it for me culture. Now, that's necessary in some areas of life. For instance, if you're going to buy a car or a house, you weigh the cost. You should do that. It's important to do. You know, like the location of the house, the neighborhood's really nice, the cost is a little high, but location, right? And the house is big enough for the family, and so you weigh all that out, and it makes sense, and so you do that. For followers of Jesus, we have to remember that the ultimate deciding vote isn't the benefit that I receive. The ultimate deciding vote is, what does God want me to do? What does God want me to do? So God gets to trump everything. But it's natural to weigh the benefits and the costs of everything in our culture. The trouble is that this consumer identity is so deeply ingrained in us by this time that we tend to use that consumer idea for everything. So when we enter into relationships, it tends to be cost-benefit analysis, right? You like this person because of this list of reasons, but then again, they do this list of things that you're not too crazy about, and so you weigh them out, cost versus benefit. And that's pretty natural. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in a relationship with somebody that everything they did bugged me, would you? Maybe you are, right? When we weigh the benefits versus cost, that is what we often call the contractual relationship. You know, you give me these benefits, and I'll put up with these things that you do. And you know, and they're about, and they're doing the same thing. I mean, honestly, when you're looking at your beginning friendships, they're weighing the cost versus the benefit to themselves. It's a contractual thing, and like with contracts, when the cost outweighs the benefit, then we usually end up ending those contracts, and we move on. So this is so deeply ingrained in us that a lot of us even decide what we believe is true based on cost versus benefits. I hear things like this sometimes. I don't like to believe that God is not in control of certain things that have happened because it makes me feel so insecure. Or I don't think God really wants us to reserve sex for marriage because that feels so restricting to me. I really don't think God wants me to be frustrated. So we build beliefs based on whether we like them or not, and we even do this on what is really true or false. For instance, I had a person say once, I really believe in Jesus because it's good to know that I'm loved, and I believe it's true because it makes my life work better. Well, I'm glad that person believed in Jesus, but that's not a very good reason to believe. We really ought to believe because it's true, not just because you like it. And I'm not sure where we got the idea that what is true about reality is supposed to conform to our expectations and preferences. But that's a part of our society today as well. The idea is just crazy when you think about it. We've learned, if we've learned anything about science over the last 100 years and all the world as we're coming to know our Earth and our solar system and all that better, with all the quantum physics and all those things, the world and everything is much stranger or different than what we thought it would be. It's totally bizarre. It doesn't fit our expectations, but it's the truth. Also, I think just growing up would teach us that reality sometimes doesn't conform to our preferences. Has anybody but me learned that? because we bump up against it all the time. Reality doesn't conform to us. We have to conform to reality. Our preferences and reality, however, don't always match. There's some things I would like not to happen, but that doesn't mean that's the way it's going to be. So if you put your preferences up against reality, reality wins. Okay? You know that. I don't care how much you prefer, if you don't put on a parachute and jump out of a plane, reality wins. Right? Gravity wins. It doesn't matter if you prefer that you didn't fall or not. That's really the way life is going to be. So this idea that reality is going to conform to our preferences and our beliefs is just ludicrous. But the consumer mindset is so ingrained inside of us that we forget that. And sometimes we even define truth based on their preferences and expectations. I was saying something to a district superintendent recently, and he said, well, that may be your truth. And I'm thinking, well, no, I was there and this happened, so I'm pretty sure what I said was truth. It's not my truth or anybody else's truth. It's just what took place. But this is so ingrained in us that it's natural that people even look at the church this way. We're consumers, so the church is the provider. And we'll decide which church we're going to go to based on our preferences and our expectations. And so here's how many people think. Here's Church A and here's Church B. In Church A, they have good music. I like the people a lot. It's only 5 minutes from my house, and there are some benefits here. Now for Church B, my kids have more fun there. The preacher's really fun, and Church A, the preacher's kind of wacko. But Church B, it's preacher's really fun. He tells good stories, and there are benefits to Church B, but it's 12 minutes from our house, and the music's not quite as good. But they do have these cool cup holders that you can put your coffee cup into while you're listening to the sermon, which sometimes get a little lengthy, and it's hard to hold the cup that long. So we keep weighing what we're going to do and where we're going to go. And honestly, some churches, that's their whole idea, is just to cater, because they know that there are a lot of options, and the competition is getting tougher and tougher, if you want to call it that. And so we all ratchet up our games. So you have the people who throw $30,000 into every weekend service, the set of services that are awesome and kicking services, just so that the people will keep coming back every week. And in the meantime, just a few blocks away downtown, there are these homeless people. But they are really not on our radar, right? Because they don't really help us attract and keep customers. And now there's nothing wrong with trying to attract and keep people. I mean, that's unless that's the end in of itself. So we're preparing sermons in this kind of an environment, and yes, we have to track religious consumers, and we keep religious consumers. So you want your sermons to have funny stories and nice ideas, and you sure don't want to have anything that's going to be offensive, because consumers don't like to be offended, right? They will take their business down the road to the competition, so you have to take everything out that anyone might consider offensive. And so what we end up sometimes with is as a sort of a McDonald's version of church. You have Mac Christianity and a Mac church, where you preach a Mac gospel where nothing is offensive and everything is nice and gentle, and you preach Mac Jesus, who is just there to make your life just a little bit sweeter, offering some Mac salvation so you can be sure you go to heaven when you die. Oh, and we might throw in a few Mac ministries so that you can feel good about yourself. And all this costs so much, but it's so worth it unless you're one of the homeless people a few blocks away downtown. What's wrong with this picture, this consumer church, this Mac church? The goal of attracting and keeping people is good. That's good, okay? We all want to reach as many people as we can, and we're willing to meet people where they're at. As missionaries in this land, and that's what we've been called, we are not of this world, we're of the kingdom of God, and we've used the kingdom language through the series. But as missionaries in this land, what we need to do is meet people where they're at and then help take them to where God wants them to be. So the ingenuity and the creativity of the churches that they use to do this is admirable and amazing at times, I tell you. And you can learn things from that. But the problem starts if you start watering down what you stand for and what you believe in order to meet other people's wants. That can become a problem. So really the issue is this. You can become so consumed with people meeting people's wants that you don't give people what they need. And what people need is often, I know this from self, is not often what we want. Need and want don't always match. So what people really need is to encounter the life of God in Jesus Christ. They need to encounter that Jesus Christ that can free them from their addictions and their consumer mindset. Free them from the addiction that thinking that everything in the world is about them. It affects our church relationships. It affects our family relationships. It affects our small group relationships. I think sometimes we need to be freed from always considering and weighing out the cost versus benefit. I don't think people need a gospel that conforms to the cultural norms and expectations, the cultural common sense preferences. People don't need a gospel that just complements their lives and fundamentally leaves us unchanged. I think what people desperately need and really want, what people are longing for, is a life of God that can transform us from the inside out, that confronts everything in our lives, something that challenges our most fundamental assumptions so that we can know our relationship with God, we can know ourselves and our world. I think what we desperately need is the real gospel of the real Jesus Christ, who's willing to confront all the stuff in the culture, all the stuff that's not good or healthy for us, confront all that stuff that's not consistent with the will of God, and actually to call in question things that we fundamentally believe and the cultural common sense assumptions that we've held on to for our entire lives. So what we need, I think, is not another gospel that conforms to everything. Now that means that the gospel has to risk being offensive sometimes. See, there's a dimension to the gospel that risks offending people. And I think we have to never lose that. Paul talks about it in Galatians because this isn't something new for our society. You know, the Galatian church had come under the influence of some Jewish Christians who, even though they believed in Jesus, they also believed that a person had to abide by the Jewish law in order to be rightly related to God. That's the way they had grown up in their lives. And so that was still a part of the new covenant. And so they required all the male Gentiles that came to faith in Jesus Christ to be circumcised, because circumcision was the sign of the covenant or the pledge to keep the whole law. And let me tell you, Paul, by the time he gets to chapter 5 in his writing, Paul is livid. He is so mad. You can see it in his writing. He preaches them about the freedom in Jesus Christ. And this is what he says in Galatians 5, verses 10 through 12. He says, I'm convinced about you in the Lord that you won't think any other way. But the one who is confusing you will pay the penalty, whoever that may be. Continues, brothers and sisters, if I'm still preaching circumcision, why am I still being harassed? In that case, the offense of the cross has been canceled. Keep in mind on that. I wish the ones that were upsetting you so would castrate themselves. Now here's Paul. He's got a sense of humor, and man, it bites when he's mad. He just came right out and was even to the point of being vulgar here. But what I want us to focus on in this phrase is the offense of the cross, that it must not be canceled or abolished. We need to understand that the message of the cross that Paul was preaching was really offensive to the Jews. It really was offensive. It was not acceptable in any way. For one thing, they believed that the Messiah was supposed to come. Now, remember, Jesus, our Christian faith believes that he's the Messiah, the Christ. They believed that the Messiah was supposed to come, was going to beat up or kill their enemies. He was going to free Israel to be a sovereign nation once again. They would rise to their supreme importance and this beautiful, wonderful nation that they had under David and King Solomon. They thought that they were going to benefit from the kingdom. They thought they were going to benefit from the Messiah coming. And here's Paul preaching that the Messiah, instead of doing that, gets himself crucified by the enemies he's supposed to annihilate, that he's supposed to squash, and then he calls us to live the same kind of life. That's not what the Jewish people wanted to hear. That wasn't the Messiah they wanted to follow. That Messiah did not conform to their preferences. They couldn't see their benefit. What's in it for me from that Messiah? And not only that, but the message of the cross is that we are being transformed by the love of God being poured into us, and that we're not bound by external regulations. Not that big deal to us, it may seem, but think about this. The law had served its purpose and had led us to Christ, and this was deeply offensive to the Jews that Paul's talking about. That was to them what our consumer mindset is to us, I would say. This was the center of their culture, the law. It was the foundation of their religion. It was what made them special. They were the law keepers. They were known in their whole world as that. God gave them the law. This was their uniqueness. And now Paul was saying that Jesus fulfilled the law and that the law no longer controlled them, and that was deeply offensive. There was nothing in their church world that prepared them for that. So when some Jews became Christians, they still hung on to the law, this law thing, right? It was a cultural thing. It made them special, and so they wanted to impose them on the Gentiles and the other people because this is what makes us special. And so Paul responds by saying this. He said, I can conform to that. That's what he's saying in Galatians 5. I could conform to that. It would make me preaching the gospel a whole lot easier if I just met the cultural expectations. After all, Jesus himself was a Jew. But he also says if I did that, I would benefit because then I would be doing it for my benefit because I'd be doing it so I didn't have to be persecuted as much, right? On the other hand, it takes the offense out of the cross. And according to Paul's writing, he says that should never, ever happen. So the way he proves that Gentiles should not be subject to circumcision, at least for religious reasons, is that they would remove the offensiveness of the cross in that setting. And he's intimating here that the cross is supposed to be offensive. It's a dimension of the message of the cross. Part of the good news, we call it today, is that it's edgy, it confronts things, and because of that, it can be offensive. Another place where Paul's talking about this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, where he says this, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are being destroyed, but it is the power of God for those who are being saved. So if we're really preaching the good news of Jesus Christ, it's going to look foolish and weak to everyone who's thinking in the terms of the world's strength and power and thinking in our terms of our cultural expectations. Paul says that if we're preaching a gospel that doesn't look foolish and weak to those thinking the normal patterns of the world, then we're not preaching the right gospel. That's what Paul says. He says, if your view of God doesn't look foolish and weak to other people sometimes, then you're not holding on to the right view of God. Just doesn't seem right, does it? Is it kind of offensive? So Paul is saying that on the cross, and hear this, on the cross, God displayed his power and wisdom by allowing himself to be crucified by enemies that everyone else thought he was supposed to annihilate. That's how God displayed his power. What kind of God does that? When a God flexes his omnipotent biceps and it looks like him getting crucified out of love for the very people who are killing him. That's radical. That's God's nature. That's who God is. That's what God does. And if you understand that, it's got to offend all who assume that God's power is like our power, but just to an infinite degree. That God's power is the same kind of people, or same kind of power that people are always clamoring for. God's power is a power to impose his will when he wants to. That God is simply like a cosmic Zeus who can pose threats and impose his will on people, or like this gigantic Arnold Schwarzenegger up there. I always like to, it doesn't work very well with me. But anyway, so you have Jonathan come up here and do that for me. But it's like this giant Arnold Schwarzenegger up there with these giant biceps who's forcing his way because he has the power of the universe behind him. We see that, right? That's kind of the way we think of God. But maybe the most offensive thing about the cross is that we are called to live it, not only believe it. This is going to confront our consumer mindset in a radical way, because this is for the whole church, this is for all of us, and everyone who has said, yes, I want to follow Jesus, I'll follow Jesus. It's not just something that Jesus did. It's not something that, that just happened once. This is something you and me are supposed to replicate. And so Paul actually says, when he goes back to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, he says, therefore, imitate God, dearly loved children. Live your life with love. Follow the example of Christ, who loved us and gave himself up for us. He was a sacrificial offering that smelled sweet to God. Paul is saying here that we are to imitate Christ who died on the cross. Whoa, a little offensive there, right? Did you see there that word, sacrificial, that he's talking about? These are our specific instructions for life. The Bible tells us that God became human and died on the cross for us while we were still sinners. That means that while we were still enemies of God, Paul says that Christ died for us. And then we're called to imitate that. That's going to offend some people. It's going to offend us sometimes because we don't necessarily want to do that. What that means is we are called to love our enemies. And Jesus says it very explicitly, love your enemies, bless those that persecute you, pray for those who despitefully use you, do good for them, never retaliate, turn the other cheek, and so on. Wow. That's the way God treated us. And so we're to love those people too. And see, this only makes sense to follow. It only makes sense to follow the way of the cross if the life of God is your immediate goal. It only makes sense if you've become overwhelmed by the love of God as he pours his life out on you. It only makes sense if the fullness of your life is from Jesus Christ, rather than you trying to fill it with all these other things. It only makes sense if you recognize that life on this earth is only this little dot on an infinite line, and that your life is going to go on forever, and that death is just the beginning rather than the end. See, only then does it make sense to love your enemy to the point of death. If you look at eternity, the peace and the joy of heaven, you no longer fear death. You, in giving yourself, it makes sense. But if you're looking at life with a cost versus benefit assessment, sometimes Christianity can look like all cost and no benefit in the present, and so it doesn't make any sense at all. It's offensive to us. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 what love looks like. He says that Jesus, even though he's equal to God, he was God, right? Did not cling to the equality with God. He did not cling to his privileges. He didn't cling to his advantages, but rather he set them aside to become a human being, a servant, and then to die on the cross. So God didn't cling to his blessedness, his status, his privilege of Godhead. He emptied himself of those to join the solidarity with us because we needed him to. He suffered with us and for us because we needed him to. He didn't need to do that. He chose to do that because he is an others-oriented God who pours himself out in love and makes our problems his own problems. And we are called to imitate that. Let me give you a couple of examples here. I live in a nice house, and so I don't have to worry about the weather killing me, right? But I can't just live in my happy little bubble, but I need to have an eye and a heart for those who don't have homes. I need to be in solidarity with them. You see, if I feel their pain, it motivates me to do more about that. I have some great friends. I have some lifelong friends. But I can't let that bubble of privilege prevent me from noticing people who don't have friends and then be willing to reach out a hand and enter into solidarity with them because they may need a friend. I can't just keep my little circle of friends and keep everybody else out, because not if I'm really thinking about them. Most of my life, I've not been discriminated against. I mean, I'm a white male. But I can't let that privilege and benefit keep me from entering into solidarity with people who are being discriminated against and making their pain my pain. Do you know that in communities real close to us, that some people, just because they look a little different, can't walk down a street at night without being picked up or shot or something else? That's not me, because I'm a white male, but I need to be thinking, and I need to find a way to be in solidarity with some of them that don't have the privilege that I have. You see, the church is really, I think, to be a body of people who has the opposite mindset to the consumer mindset that always asks, what's the cost and the benefit to me? As a church, we need to have the mindset that we're willing to pay the cost, not for my benefit, but we're willing to pay the cost for the benefit of others. Now that's a Christ-like mind. We're to be a body of people who receive the life of God and then who are willing to be poured out toward others with the goal of benefiting others. That's why we have East Cross Early Childhood Center. That's why we partner with Lighthouse and Concern and Mary and Martha, the Salvation Army, the Mutual Girls Club, the Samaritan Counseling Center, DHS. That's why we work with all of them. That's why we give to the Mountain of Food. You gave thousands of dollars to feed people who don't have enough food throughout the year. That's why we do Easter baskets. That's why we do angel trees. And the list goes on. We don't do these things so we'll feel good or so we can pat ourselves on the back. This is what it looks like to imitate God. That's what we do. This is what it looks like to be poured out for others. And that is what the church is called to do. Let me tell you something, though. It can feel like death. It can feel like death to let that stuff go because we've been doing it all of our lives. But then again, that old consumer self, that self-centered self, really is a miserable self. It's a perpetually striving self. It's a perpetually hungry self. It's a perpetually tired self. It's an unfulfilled self. It's an empty self. It's a futile self. And I heard once a preacher said, he said, to kill that sucker is freedom. When you kill that mindset, you get set free because you no longer need to chase and cling and pursue and strive and be angry with everyone when things don't go your way. You let go of all of that and you're free. You are now free to live with the love that Jesus loved you with and gave himself up for you while you were still his enemy. So the church is a group of people practicing how to let it go. We're practicing how to let it go. So here's the thing. The church is not here to meet your wants. Sorry if that offends you, but that's not why we're here. It is here, however, to help you and to help all of us find what we really need. That's why we're here. And there are two ways that we get poured out or we overflow to others. And I'll say this in closing. We get poured out inside and outside. Inside, we're to be poured out one to another. Okay? We do that. We need relationships that are intimate so we can pour our lives into one another. We need to build deep, meaningful relationships with one another. And that often happens in small groups. I encourage you just so strongly encourage you to be a part of a small group. And it may not even be for your sake. It may be for the sake of those who you will pour your life into. Think beyond self here. See, when we are to be poured out, and the other side of that, we're to be poured out into the world, both individually and collectively. That's when we're talking about all these ministries that we do, so that other people will know the love and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for them. We're going to receive communion in just a few moments. And communion this morning is a reminder of the love and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And it is offered to you today, not only as a reminder of God's love, but as a renewing of God's covenant with you.